Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the fifth in a series of mini-lectures on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Today we're going to talk about unconscious guilt. Last time we talked about the first two movements of the action in Volume 1. The third movement shows Pip responding to his sense of shame by seeking to educate himself and Joe so he won't have to be ashamed of the surrogate dad. These first stirrings of Pip's ambition are set off by the return of guilt, triggered by the attack on Mrs. Joe and embodied in the skulking form of Pip's alter ego, Orlick. Also entering the story in this movement is Biddy, the teacher and companion who will turn out to be Pip's lost opportunity for happiness. Finally, the third movement introduces Pip's Great Expectations, delivered with much mystery by the lawyer Mr. Jaggers. At the end of Volume 1, we see Pip on the road to London and a new life, but with little sense of joy or adventure. The struggle between shame and guilt has isolated Pip from those who love him. At the close of the volume, his great expectations have brought him nothing but loneliness and tears. The first conflict in Pip's character was between pity and guilt. We saw at the close of the last mini-lecture how these emotions attach themselves to the figures of Magwitch and Joe Gargery. Shame enters the picture when Pip first visits Miss Havisham's house and is made to feel inferior because of his manners and clothing. This shame, as we saw, transforms Pip's guilt, which was based on a moral principle, into something very different, a sense of personal inadequacy based on social class, economic status, and lack of education. The name Satis House is clearly ironic, for the one thing Pip, Estella, and Miss Havisham have in common is that they can't get no satisfaction. Pip responds to this sense of inadequacy by trying to educate himself, and at the same time growing more and more ashamed of Joe Gargery and the low home he has grown up in. Even before he learns of his great expectations, he wants desperately to become a gentleman and escape his sense of shame. At the same time, Pip has just enough awareness to feel guilty about his ingratitude to Joe and to feel lonely when his shame isolates him from Joe and Biddy. This is how the first conflict between pity and guilt turns into a second conflict between guilt and shame. And so Pip is caught in a vicious cycle. The more his original sense of guilt gets transformed into shame, the more this sense of shame blocks his capacity to empathize. In blocking compassion, shame isolates Pip from Joe. His guilt turns into shame, his shame increases guilt, and the two emotions together isolate him from those who love him. The narrative structure of Volume 1 corresponds to and matches this psychological pattern. Just as an underlying unconscious sense of guilt gets transformed into the conscious experience of shame, which then motivates the desire for status as a remedy, so too the plot movements of Volume 1 lead from guilt to shame to ambition. In this narrative, Pip's experience at Satis House comes in between his great expectations and their sordid origins, like a screen. When Mr. Jaggers arrives to announce his good fortune, Pip and everyone else assumes that his benefactor is Miss Havisham. But behind the socially respectable Miss Havisham lurks the convict Magwitch. Behind the shame Estella inspires, the guilt of a repressed link to criminality. In Volumes 2 and 3, we will see this pattern work itself out on two levels. And if you haven't read ahead yet, there's a bit of a spoiler alert here. It works out on the level of plot when the abyss between Magwitch and Estella is closed by the revelation of a hidden truth. It works out on the level of character as Pip threads his way back through shame and guilt to recover his original sense of compassion. Slowly, bit by bit, Pip uncovers the backstory of Magwitch and Miss Havisham. At the same time, he is changing and growing, working his way through pride and shame to discover the truth of his own character. The basic structure of the novel is generated by the subtle way in which Dickens weaves these two developments together. In Pip's love for Estella, Dickens introduces his version of the paradox of desire that, when we talked about Jane Austen, I called the bar. Pip can't seem to love Biddy, the girl he could and should have. He longs instead for the girl who makes him suffer. In this way, Dickens breaks the covenant Austen had worked out for her marriage plots, in which romantic love is wedded to judgment in the companionate marriage. Pip chooses love as worship over love as companionship, and separates himself from those who care most about him. The relationship between love and property is crucial to the development of Pip's character in Volume 1 because it helps to explain what he sees in Estella. To him, she embodies everything he doesn't have: wealth, status, self-sufficiency. Beauty alone probably wouldn't affect Pip the way Estella does. Her power over him comes from the meaning her beauty takes on in his eyes as she comes to embody all those things he can't be: elegant, self-sufficient, powerful, and all those things he can't have: wealth, status, admiration. Her beauty becomes the symbolic form in which all these things appear to Pip, as if they were a single object of romantic desire. Pip strives at first to make himself worthy of Estella through education, and especially by learning to read and write. It's almost as if he were going back to that opening scene in the graveyard, except that now the inaccessible world he tries to contact through writing is not the past, but a future characterized by upward social mobility, a future in which he will gain property, social status, and Estella, the girl who embodies both. Ironically, his first teacher is Biddy. In Chapter 17, Pip, working at his books, realizes that Biddy knows everything he does. He sees her suddenly in a new light and asks her to go for a Sunday walk. But instead of discovering that the world of letters has given him a connection to Biddy and through her to the family they might have, he discovers the bar. No matter how hard he tries, no matter how clearly he recognizes the stupidity and futility of worshiping Estella, Pip can't love Biddy. Why is that? I think Pip can't love Biddy because he can't love the self he would become if they were together. He feels a sense of inadequacy deep inside himself and thinks he can fill the emptiness within by becoming a gentleman. The novel shows us that this sense of inner vacancy in Pip results from the combination of guilt and shame, and especially the conversion of guilt into shame. These are the emotions that make Pip feel worthless, exposed, and vulnerable in the eyes of the world. Property, status, and education to Pip are ways of making himself feel less vulnerable to the scornful gaze of others. There's nothing about Biddy or Joe to make Pip feel guilty, but they do make him feel ashamed. And he doesn't have enough courage or a strong enough sense of self-worth to untangle the confusion between shame and guilt and stand by the values of love and humility. Instead, he launches himself on a quest for property and the status that goes with it. In doing so, he turns away from companionate marriage. If this were a Jane Austen novel, he would realize his mistake in time to marry Biddy, but it's not, and he doesn't. Meanwhile, although shame is the emotion that dominates his life in these chapters, guilt doesn't entirely fade from the story. Its presence is strange, though. We know why Pip felt guilty about helping Magwitch. I mean, we don't probably believe he should feel guilty, but we understand why he does. We should also bear in mind the constant assaults that the adults in Pip's life make on his sense of self-worth. Mrs. Joe abuses Pip both verbally and physically. Uncle Pumblechook is more insidious, but he constantly harps on how much gratitude Pip ought to feel toward his sister, how unworthy Pip is, and how likely it is that he will turn out badly. It's a commonplace of modern psychology that abused children tend to blame themselves. It was a commonplace of Protestant theology that we're all guilty of original sin and innately disposed to keep on sinning. Wherever it comes from, Pip is deeply imbued with a sense of his own guilt. We see this clearly in the odd episode of Mr. Wopsle's dramatic reading at the close of chapter 15. The text Mr. Wopsle reads is a domestic tragedy from the previous century, featuring an apprentice, and Pip, of course, is apprenticed to Joe at this point in the story, who is persuaded by the girl he loves to rob his master and murder his uncle. Pip has already robbed his master, and clearly harbors violent impulses toward his uncle Pumblechook, in whose parlor the reading takes place. He also feels guilty because his love for Estella makes him wish to be rid of Joe. All in all, then, the plot of The London Merchant, that's a real play, by the way, and the plot seems perfectly designed to arouse Pip's latent sense of guilt. That would be true even if Mr. Wopsle and Uncle Pumblechook didn't underline the connection. Adults, however, have been lecturing Pip and holding him up as an example before others since he was very small, and now Mr. Wopsle's dramatic reading carries the didactic impulse to new heights. What stung me was the identification of the whole affair with my unoffending self. When Barnwell began to go wrong, I declare that I felt positively apologetic. Pumblechook's indignant stare so taxed me with it. Wopsle, too, took pains to present me in the worst light. At once ferocious and maudlin, I was made to murder my uncle with no extenuating circumstances whatever. Even after I was happily hanged and Wopsle had closed the book, Pumblechook sat staring at me, shaking his head and saying, "Take warning, boy, take warning," as if it were a well-known fact that I contemplated murdering a near relation, provided only I could induce one to have the weakness to become my benefactor. This scene treats Pip's innate sense of guilt with a comic touch, but it is followed immediately by the discovery, when Pip arrives home that night, that Mrs. Joe has been savagely attacked. And the next chapter begins with my head full of George Barnwell. I was at first disposed to believe that I must have had some hand in the attack upon my sister. We will eventually learn that it was Orlick who attacked Mrs. Joe. It's also Orlick who follows Biddy around when Pip is with her, and Orlick who plays the outcast Cain to Pip as chosen son. In developing the theme of Pip's unconscious guilt, Dickens seems to be adding a bit of a new wrinkle to the beloved son narrative by suggesting that on some level the outcast brother is the chosen son's evil twin. Here, that suggestion comes through in the idea that Pip is guilty of Orlick's crime. As a violent, secretive character who skulks about like a criminal, Orlick links the third movement of Volume 1 back to its opening, reminding us of Pip's secret bond to the convict Magwitch. This link is itself a repressed or guilty secret, since the events at Miss Havisham's house make Pip reluctant to remember or acknowledge his tie to Magwitch. Having rejected the narrative of companionate marriage he might have had with Biddy, Pip thinks the story of his great expectations will link him finally to Estella. What he learns instead is that his story must return to its origins and undo the repression that has buried them. In this way, Dickens offers a narrative pattern in which the discovery of hidden truths corresponds to the undoing of psychological repression. Dickens offers this, and it's more than just a novel. It's a template for a certain kind of novel, a certain conception of identity and the story of the self. Dickens offers this as the paradigmatic story of the modern self. And it's enormously influential. All of Freudian psychoanalysis already lies in seed form in this novel. Well, we've spent a long time on Volume 1 in order to clarify the structure and meaning of this story and the narrative contract on which it's based. In the next 4 mini-lectures, we'll move more quickly through volumes 2 and 3, seeing how this pattern plays out.